All right, what it do? What it do? Um, I'm just trying to, spitball here as I am trying to just get in the routine of saying my thoughts. And so, apologies for anyone listening, if there is anyone listening, if it's rambly at times. But I think today I kind of want to just talk a little bit about the myth of meritocracy. And I think the reason I care so much about it is because the foundation of inequality in this country and globally, I think it depends on the country, but at least in the United States, like the justification that is primarily used to explain why some people have billions of dollars and some people are dirt poor is merit. It's this idea that the people who are at the top were either the hardest working or the smartest or the most clever or, but in that by some, by their own virtue, they got to the position they are in life and they deserve the fruits of their labor, right? And so, or smart decision making if it's just like them investing capital and not necessarily working. But, and that's kind of what is the default understanding of why some people have a lot and why people have so little. And it's something that was ingrained in me tacitly and explicitly throughout my life. Not to put my wonderful mother on blast, but something that she would say when I was little is that, like if you don't do well in school, you'll end up working at McDonald's. So the underlying implication is that people who do well in school, then go on to college, become professionals, and make a lot of money that they deserve because they did all the right things, and that the people who work at McDonald's are there because they were lazy or made bad choices, and that is their destiny, or not their destiny, but that's their just reward for their behavior. So, I think this is all bullshit. I think this entire concept is fundamentally flawed, and I think it's important for all of broader society in the United States to vocalize that and to use the term normalize that, so that when we have conversations about inequality and why it can and should be fixed, as in making things more equitable and equal, that people have an understanding as to why, and they won't have to, fall like the people against that won't. Their arguments about merit and all that stuff don't hold any water. So people will be able to argue against those false ideas. And so, I think part of the problem is that, like I said, like there's such an indoctrination about the American dream, right? And it's this idea that people who work hard and make good choices, smart choices, and strike when there's opportunity, that they will get ahead in life, and that's possible for everybody. That's one of the major assumptions, in that it's good, that it's a good thing for those who are ambitious and pursue to rise to the top, because it's beneficial for everybody, because they have the gifts and skills and the willingness to work in order for everyone to benefit. And because so many people buy into that, whether implicitly or explicitly, they that idea is propagated to the point where it leads to these ludicrous situations where you have people like Jeff Bezos that are worth more than entire countries, entire like developed economies, like a pretty insane, just distribution of wealth. And that's one. There's another justification that's about private property and individual rights that I might touch on, but that might deserve its own conversation. But focusing on the myth of on the meritocratic justification for inequality, I think that my goal for making a point to say this here and hopefully to spread the word, across the country and maybe even the globe. And I'm not the only person doing this, thankfully, but there needs to be more people pushing this aggressively, is because I think once people lose the pretense of the meritocracy justification and the individual rights justification, but again, focusing on the meritocracy aspect, I think then people will more assertively and aggressively begin demanding structural changes to our society and to our to our economic order, and political order, I would say as well. And so in order to do that, you kind of have to refute the concept, right? And so I think that one of the most obvious places to start is inheritance. Some people in this country are born into poverty. They are born in environments in which, from the moment they're conceived, not even born, there's toxins in the environment, there's stress, there's violence, there's neglect, and once they're born, there's so little resources that it really is a bare minimum survival. And as they grow, a lot of the people who were born in poverty face abuse and trauma and are victims of crimes and all sorts of horrible things. And even those who don't have like the worst of the worst happen to them, it's still a deficient upbringing in comparison to what someone of a middle class or upper class background would have, right? Which you could describe as like access to quality education, access to healthcare, access to just positive cultural examples of being a quote unquote productive, successful member of society, rather than someone who has to get by through crime or deception or whatever. And the lack of hope, because a lot of people in impoverished environments feel like they're trapped, and rightfully so. A lot of them are trapped and will never actually get out of their circumstances. And so the inheritance aspect from the get-go already raises questions into the meritocracy, because it's like, well, if you start from zero, and someone starts from 80 in the 100-meter dash, clearly that's not a fair equal playing field, and it's not. Most people would say, hey, that's not fair. That's not most people's intrinsic sense of justice or fairness goes against that situation. And so if the person who starts at the 80 mark wins, you wouldn't say, well, he won entirely because of his merit or primarily because of his merit and his gifts and his seizing opportunities. You would say, no, like that person started at an enormous advantage, and because they are, because they were there to start and the other person was starting at zero, like the other person never stood a chance, and to claim that this is somehow fair is ridiculous. And so that's in effect our society. Like we have people who begin in complete wealth, where their parents and family members and community and whatever connections are all close to the locus of power and resources. And so for them, like there's this concept of like failing upward. Like even people who do poorly in those settings, according to whatever standards are based there, they still end up quote unquote succeeding in comparison to people who started in less fortunate circumstances. And so people can fail school and they can be kind of deadbeats, and but they might inherit money, or they might have a lot of interventions from people that from family members or community members or professionals that they can afford to hire to intervene in a person who's straying from whatever path they allegedly should be on. And so there's just the fact that you start off at different positions, such radically different positions. Like, it's not even like, okay, like somebody gets like some extra gifts on Christmas. Like, it's like some people experience hunger on a regular basis in this country. And then there's people who literally have all the food they can ever envision at their fingertips, And so that to me is a ridiculous argument that right off the bat, I think, knocks the legs off the meritocratic argument. So a common counter argument that happens is, like there's people who rose from poverty and they became amazing, and there's like stories of entrepreneurs that lived in their car and became billionaires, and there's people who like really were homeless or poor or in prison or old or whatever it might be, and ended up succeeding. And I always to say to that, that's great. That person is exceptional. That person is remarkable. But that's not the norm. And in a society, you should, in my opinion, create a system that benefits the largest possible number of people, not just a small number of people based on these, alleged characteristics, which, as you can already tell, are not even that valid to begin with. So I congratulate everybody who comes from the bottom, who started from the bottom and or had humble beginnings and was able to make something, even if they don't make massive wealth success in terms of like becoming famous or extraordinarily wealthy, but just people who they carve out a middle class lifestyle coming from poverty, blah, and again, the American dream of like being able to sustain yourself, have some comforts, have some security, and provide for your descendants, right? Those people who manage to achieve that, that's great, but the statistics don't bear this out. Most people in this country, and this has gotten worse over time, because there used to be a time where there was a large portion of the population that could move from being poor to being middle class, or from being middle class to being wealthy, and that's prior to the current neoliberal era that we're in. So prior to Ronald Reagan, where that was more true, but since the 1980s, that's been in decline to a point where that's increasingly unlikely that someone from being poor, middle class, or rich will ever move from that position. If you're born middle class, you'll probably end up being middle class. If you're born poor, you'll probably end up being poor, and that's only become more true over time. And so, how is it that we're in a meritocracy if more and more people, regardless of effort, still wind up in the same conditions that they were born into? So yeah, that's a good counter argument to the the people, the rags to riches stories, or pulling yourself up from the bootstraps. And and again, I don't think an entire society should be founded in this idea that just because you have the small chance, if you do everything right, or intelligently or whatever, to improve your station in life, that you should base an entire economic system around that. There's further arguments that people go into as to that's capitalism, and capitalism is the best economic system that we know of, and therefore we should maintain that because doing anything else would be much worse. To which I say, show me the evidence. People will be like, oh, well, communism. When it's like, well, I'm not necessarily advocating for communism. I'm not saying that all of the means of production need to be owned by the government or workers, but I do think that there's some obvious policy solutions that can be implemented which will fundamentally change the structure of our economy so that more people really can improve their station in life. And that even those at the bottom who, let's say they don't, or people who fall to the bottom of the income scale, that they have a baseline level of existence that's dignified, that has some basic rights provided for by society. And so, yeah, the merit argument just doesn't hold water, and and to kind of like dive into it more, like some people will say, well, take Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos, and you can say this about Bill Gates and Zuckerberg and all these people. They took their own money and they took a big risk, and they invested all of their creativity and resources into it, and the risk paid off. And a lot of time it doesn't, which is why it's a risk, right? So they're remarkable for figuring it out, and they deserve the fruits of their labor, which benefits all of us, because we all now have Amazon and Microsoft and all these wonderful things that we benefit from. To which I say, okay, I'll agree with you that Jeff Bezos took this risk, or Mark Zuckerberg, or whatever, and that they deserve some compensation. But it's the magnitude of the compensation that I take issue with. It's the fact that they have more wealth than the average person could achieve in countless lifetimes. Like they make more money in a second, or a minute or whatever it is, than a person makes in a year. Like it's this insane disproportionality, that's a word, between those at the top and everybody else, that you can't align it with you can, but I think it's absurd to make the claim that is a proportional reward for their contributions, and it also discounts a variety of different things. Number one, that all the value that was contributed to the companies that were created from everybody else. It's not like Jeff Bezos single-handedly delivers all the packages and creates all the technology and does everything in order to make Amazon what it is. Obviously, there's thousands and thousands, I forget the size of Amazon now, I know it's a huge employer, but okay, tens of thousands, whatever the number is, of people who work every day, the majority of their waking hours trying to provide this service, and to sell these products. And so why is Jeff Bezos getting the lion's share of all of that just because he was the first one to push, for it, to the first one to take the risk? I mean, I'm sure plenty of other people took risks. And, again, they probably were compensated with shares in the company. But what about everyone else? Why isn't that every employee doesn't have some share in the company if they're deciding to contribute themselves? Like, why is it that for the top people, compensation is sufficient if it includes, stock, right, in the company, but for the majority, their compensation is sufficient just by wages, and I or salary, whatever. I disagree with that. I think that, the more you invest yourself in a company, the more ownership you should be able to claim, and it shouldn't be, purely based on, well, I was early, and I took a risk when things weren't, popping. So, I think the problem is that the current structure grossly undervalues the contributions that everybody makes every day to this company, and overvalues the contribution that Jeff Bezos and the initial team brought in, because of the theoretical size of the risk that they were making, which I think is completely overblown. It's not like Jeff Bezos stood to lose billions of dollars. Like, at worst, he would have gone bankrupt and shut down his company. Like, it's a very different, the equation, in terms of the type of risk that he was undertaking. So another quick thing I should mention about this is that a lot of these entrepreneurs and business people, they start with something that the vast majority of people don't have in this country, and especially all over the world, which is access to capital. Jeff Bezos started this company with a couple $100,000 that he put together with his own money, his family, yada, yada, yada. And that in of itself is already out of reach for the vast majority of the population. Most people cannot get a business loan of that size because their credit doesn't qualify. Most people don't have the connections or the resources available to them to acquire that and then take this kind of risk like he did. And so he was already, it's not like Jeff Bezos was like a poor guy, who just like through sheer ingenuity and gumption got to, make this a huge thing. He started with already being from an upper middle class background, as did Bill Gates, as did Mark Zuckerberg. And that had an enormous impact because even if they failed, they likely would have been okay in terms of having their basic needs met and even living a somewhat comfortable life had things not worked out with their venture. And so that's another thing that needs to be said against this notion. Now, yes, again, some people might be amazing and do start from rags to riches. I've heard those stories. They're great. They're inspiring. But that is not the norm, and we're talking about how to organize our society in a way that benefits the most, which is what I think is the best. So I think I do have to make some mention of the individual property rights, or just property rights arguments, because some people will say, well, listen, man, like the market decides that we as individuals all purchase Amazon products, and we have all collectively decided that they're worth X amount. And so we decide that Jeff Bezos is worth all the billions of dollars that he is in the evaluation of the Amazon stock. And, we can choose not to do that. We can choose not to purchase his products and make him, behave in different ways if he wants to, be wealthier. To which I say, sure, that's true. Like you could, you can. I think that's a very sensible argument to say that yes, we all implicitly do that, but there's a lot of other things at play, and I think that have to come into consideration, which ultimately refute this idea, right? And one of them is that the lack of competition. Amazon is very clearly a monopoly in the distribution of goods and services. Like there's very few companies that could effectively put on a fight for a number of fascinating reasons, that people who are much more informed on finance and business could talk about. But Amazon doesn't you could say there's like Walmart and I don't even know, like Kroger, like I don't know what the competition would even be, like what you would consider the potential competition to Amazon. But whatever it is, it's not anywhere near close the size of this behemoth. And this applies as well to Google and Facebook and to some degree to Apple. Like they might have one or two competitors, some of these, and in some instances there is more even competition. But again, this isn't like a free market of opportunity. This is like an oligopoly. There's like a handful, like a cartel almost. Like there's a handful of, companies that get to set the prices because there's so few of them. And they have total control, and they might compete with one another, but a lot of the time they share a lot of the same employees and a lot of the same executives anyway. So it's not even, like it's not like they're totally hostile to each other necessarily. So, and the other thing is that the prices aren't set by us. Like, people will say this is a very complex economic argument, but people will say, well, there's a willingness to pay, right? Like if Amazon charged $1 million for, a pair of shoes, you wouldn't buy it. Sure. But there's a lot of wiggle room in that willingness to pay for people, for every person, right? And so if all the shoes are presented at a certain price, and I'm just an individual, like my decision to not buy something because it's too expensive or not expensive enough is not that influential. It's the aggregate behavior of all these people, but the aggregate behavior is influenced by these large institutions. It's not like a perfect competition of all these buyers and sellers, setting these prices to an equilibrium. That's a very theoretical, abstract model that doesn't really reflect in reality. The reality is these companies know that they can command a certain amount of value and that people will agree to it without much of a fight, because why would we? Like, how could we? Like, we would have to all rally together and be like, okay, we will not agree to buy Amazon's product unless it, charges less or pays its employees more. Like, these are enormous collective actions that have enormous, barriers to entry, if you can even call it that, barriers to execution, maybe. So, that doesn't, like, that's not a realistic thing to just say, oh, well, you just don't buy it. And another thing is, a lot of these things become essential, right? Like, if you want to use a computer and you want to use word processing software, there's not that many alternatives to Microsoft Word or Google Docs. There's two, and you're kind of forced to use either one. Like, we don't have this freedom of choice that some hardcore capitalists would say that we do. We have a very limited set of options who determine the price, and we simply agree to that price, because it's not like I can call Amazon and be like, hey, the box of batteries, it's for $10, but I don't agree with that. Make it $5. They'll be like, that's great. Have a nice day. And, again, it would take this enormous concerted effort that is very unlikely and very difficult to arrange in order to actually have that kind of influence against their price setting. And so that to me is another argument, is like, we're not choosing to value Jeff Bezos at that amounts only because we make these purchasing decisions. Now, another thing is the stock market is not an even playing field. So not everyone owns stock, right? And of the people that own stock, it's not evenly distributed. And so, when you have a smaller and smaller group of people owning more and more stock and institutions, they get to determine the value of Amazon in the economy, which affects everybody regardless of ownership in the stock market. And it's based on their perception of what is valuable and what isn't. And that isn't democratic, because someone who's super wealthy might decide, I think Amazon's nanotech is super, I don't even know if they have that, is super important, and all of society needs to value that. And all their rich friends agree, and they all decide to buy Amazon stock and drive the price up, and they're all like obsessed with Amazon stock, right? But like the rest of society could say, hey, we actually think we need to invest in our schools and our healthcare and I don't know, like better environmental products, like getting off plastic, and using biodegradables, whatever, right? The point is that it's not like we all agreed to say, Amazon is worth this much. It's that a small group of people, of which within them they don't even have equal ownership. There's some people who are more influential than others, determine the price of something. And then the other thing is, it's largely speculative, right? Like, it's like people thinking that Amazon will be worth something in the future because of its current set of innovations and plans and revenue and all that stuff. And that is also a problem, because that is that speculative aspect which overinflates the value of Amazon's contributions to society. What I mean by that is that if everyone got together and decided democratically, everyone had one vote, which is what democracy is, and said, here's what I think needs to be valued in society. And they just listed everything from like veterinarians to, furniture, like whatever. Like, and the order, if you took the aggregate vote totals of what's at the top and what's at the bottom, that might not reflect the actual valuation of things in society for a variety of different reasons. So really, what's valuable is determined by this elite cabal, whatever you want to call it, group of people who have ownership and decide to influence the market, and it's separate from what some would call the real economy, which is like there is an exchange of goods and services happening that has value, but the less cash that those people have, the less influence they have to say what they're doing is valuable versus what the super wealthy is doing is valuable. So what I mean by that is, like, if I have had to barter a lot of services in my life where because I didn't have money. I've been mostly, I was middle class growing up with my family, but I became working class and poor at times in my post-college years. And so a lot of the time I didn't have money to pay for somebody's service. And if I had cash, I would just pay them cash, because I would say, hey, your service, yeah, it's worth $200 to me, but I didn't. And so what I would say is, in exchange for your service, I will provide you a service I can offer. So we do some kind of barter. And that's becoming increasingly common because more and more cash is being sucked out of larger and larger amounts of the population. So the cash, the only reason we could use our own separate currency, like the bottom 99% could decide, where there's a currency for the bottom 99, and then there's a currency for the 1%. And our currency is, we democratically decide what's valuable and what isn't, right? And the top 1%, they say that Amazon's worth $1 billion. Well, it's $1 billion of their currency, which we don't value. And then maybe the market would reflect a more accurate picture of what most people think is and isn't valuable and by how much. But that's not the case. And so, you know, the direction that the country goes in is largely determined by this small group of actors who got to the position, again, not necessarily because of meritocratic aspects. They might have merit might be a portion of it, but I largely attribute those things to the system, you know, which is, where were you born? What were the resources available to you? What was your home life like? Your relationship to your family and how that psychologically affected you? You know, based on your identity, what were the options that you were allowed to pursue? Like, there's all these factors that play into that, and none of which have to do with the person's ability. And so, you know, that is, you know, I guess I did end up stepping a little bit into the property argument, but overall what I'm trying to say is that, you know, we're not in a system where virtue is what gets you up top, or even, and you know, in a lot of like the free market, people say, well, virtue is the ideal, but we deal with the real, and so we deal with whatever people decide. And I say, yeah, but what people decide isn't democratic. The market is not a democratic system. It decides based on who has, like, decisions are made unequally. So what I decide is important and valuable is not the same as what Jeff Bezos decides. He has, you know, orders of magnitude more votes, if you want to call it, over what's valuable and what's not. And that's not fair. Some people would say, well, it's because he has that money because he deserves it, therefore he deserves to have a wider opinion. But again, it's not like he started from an initial point where everything was equal and everyone had the same amount of resources. He already had a leg up. And most people that become wealthy or super wealthy come from already being somewhat wealthy, or at least having a stable middle class life. And again, most people in general do not move out of their economic circumstance. They're trapped in their life. And so there really isn't social mobility. And so the whole premise of the United States is that immigrants can come to this country and there's social mobility. If you work hard and you can, you know, and you do your job well and you don't commit crimes or whatever, you can get ahead and have a comfortable life. That's the American dream. That's the promise of all the technology and innovation and all that stuff. That is not true for the majority of the population. That is a myth. It is the myth of meritocracy. And so what I want to see is people say, funny that, you know, I've been working at this company for 20 years and I never got a promotion, but this one young kid who got his MBA at Booth, he only had, you know, internship experience, but they immediately put him in management positions because he went to Booth. And that person, turns out that they grew up in an upper middle class background and their parents were college educated. And I could be someone who just was truly rags to riches getting this job, but I never move ahead because of that person. It's not meritocratic. So when you look at your boss or your management or your superiors, they're not necessarily there because they're good at their jobs, you know, or because they're that much harder working than you or that much smarter than you. A lot of the time, it's simply because the people above them decided that that's who they wanted to have for whatever list of reasons. Are there meritocratic elements within the system? Absolutely. But they exist in pockets, and to get into those pockets, you already have to have all of these resources, typically like a college degree, being kind of the defining one, which is increasingly out of reach for most people. So I really want people to get away from this myth of meritocracy. I really want people to think about, it's that I want them to think that when they see their bosses or people that are making more money, that they don't think, well, they deserve it because they work that much harder. They think that person took advantage of opportunities that were available to them but not to me, right? Because a lot of the time that's the case, is like you didn't have a wealthy uncle that invested in your startup company, or you didn't have parents who could help pay for your expenses when you went to college, and so you dropped out because you were working full-time in order to pay for your student loans. Or you were a poor student because you grew up in a poor neighborhood and you didn't have, like any opportunities in terms of academic advancement. And there's a whole thing, with academia, I mean, shit, I can talk about that forever, but even the fact that we tell children, that we put children on a path in their life based on what they accomplish in the first 18 years of their life, which is their childhood, and based on their childhood, we say, you are going to be this and you're going to be that. That, I think, is enormously unfair, because it puts an enormous burden on children that they can, effectively doom themselves to a life of misery if they make bad choices when they don't even have full judgment developed. It's like, if everyone had access to college and college was free, which is what I think it should be, at least public universities and community colleges, and it's different. But to get into a lot of these schools, not only is the financial barrier, but you have to have a certain, amount of grades, and I wonder if that's even necessary. I wonder if you should just allow people, and then once they're in the institution, I could see the argument of like, well, you can't pass unless you achieve these certain milestones of knowledge, right? That I, there's much more weight to that, and I buy into that. But, even the idea of like admissions into colleges being based on, prior achievement, it's like, what if someone's parent died, or what if someone got sick with cancer? Like, these are things, again, that have nothing to do with merit, that happen all the time in a variety of different ways, that have enormous outcomes in a child's life. So why are we condemning children to a life of poverty, or a life of working a miserable job that hasn't, never allows them to get out of their situation, simply because when they were in school they were average student, or they weren't able to be exceptional? And another thing is, like, it's not like all the parents, like, of the smart kids were smart themselves, and so therefore the kids were smart because of genetics or something, which is a very eugenicist argument, which has been used, unfortunately. But the reason a lot of the wealthy kids and, who go to good schools end up going to good colleges is because they have all these, like, resources. They have parents who care. They have tutors and teachers and programs and all these things to ensure that whatever the admissions process is to get into these elite universities, they're into it. And once you're in that elite university, then it becomes a network thing, where it's like, well, these universities have the networks of the major companies that can provide enough capital and blah, 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 and so on and so forth. So, But to wrap things up, I mean, there's so much more I could say about meritocracy, but I guess what I want to end on is this needs to change. This needs to end. We need to, as a society, stop. I'm not saying get mad at someone for getting promoted or making more money than you. It's more saying that person should not tell you that they're doing that they make more money than you, or that they get promoted because they're better than you. Because even if that is the case, that's in a particular context, that takes away the rest of the context of, like, people's lives that lead up to those points where those people are able to achieve more than you because they've had all these opportunities anyways. And a lot of time that isn't the case. There's people who work their asses off, are smart and diligent, but because they just don't have the right connections, they never get out of it. So we need to stop buying into that, so we can therefore move on to this idea of, like, well, how should we organize our society and reward people for their work if the current system doesn't actually properly evaluate their contributions, overvalues the contributions of some, undervalues the contributions of others, and makes it so that it's so intractable that some people cannot get out of their, lane, which is the entire premise of the American dream. So really, this is about the American dream and how it was always a dream to some extent, but less so in the past. But now it is most definitely a myth.